Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system, and let me be very, very clear. This is a moment where promise and peril are going to collide.
Decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
What if the Book of Enoch isn't just mythology, but something far more real? For centuries, the Book of Enoch has remained one of the most controversial and mysterious texts ever discovered, filled with strange visions, celestial beings, and accounts that never made it into mainstream religious canon. Now, with the power of Grok AI, researchers are analyzing its language, patterns, and hidden meanings in ways never before possible. But instead of clarity, the results are revealing connections and interpretations that are forcing people to rethink what this ancient text might actually represent. If you're new here, subscribe and follow along. We cover ancient texts, forgotten history, and the questions that most channels won't ask. What is the Book of Enoch and why was it hidden? The Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch, is an ancient Jewish religious text attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. It dates back to somewhere between 300 BCE and 100 BCE, though many scholars believe sections of it are even older. It tells the story of Enoch's journey through the heavens, his encounters with angels and fallen beings, and detailed visions of judgment, the cosmos, and the end of time. For most of Western Christianity, this book simply doesn't exist in the official canon. It was excluded from the Bible during the early church councils, and for over 1,000 years, the complete version was essentially lost to the Western world. The only Christian tradition that kept it in its official scripture was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and they held on to it in the ancient Ge'ez language. That's actually where the first full version came back to the Western world, when Scottish explorer James Bruce brought copies back from Ethiopia in 1773. What makes it significant is this. The Book of Enoch is directly referenced in the biblical Book of Jude, and many scholars believe it influenced the theology of the New Testament writers. Jesus and his disciples almost certainly knew of this text. So the big question has always been, why was it removed? Was it too radical? Too detailed? Or did it contain ideas that certain authorities didn't want circulating freely? That mystery is exactly what made people want to run it through AI in the first place. They wanted to look at it without the filter of centuries of religious politics, and Grok gave them a way to do exactly that. What is Grok AI and why use it for this? Grok is an AI developed by xAI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company. It launched in late 2023 and has been positioned as an AI that's designed to answer questions with a little more directness and willingness to explore unconventional territory than some of its competitors. It draws on a massive training data set and can perform deep textual analysis, identify themes, compare literary structures, and summarize complex ideas. Now, AI analyzing ancient religious texts isn't entirely new. Researchers have been using computational tools on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, and the New Testament for years. But what's different about running something like the Book of Enoch through a conversational AI like Grok is accessibility. Regular people, not just university scholars, can ask layered questions and get structured answers back. You can ask it to compare chapters, identify recurring symbols, or explain theological implications in plain language. What researchers and enthusiasts found when doing this was that Grok didn't just summarize the Book of Enoch. It identified structural patterns, thematic clusters, and theological tensions within the text that had previously been discussed only in academic papers that most people never read. It also drew connections between the Book of Enoch and other ancient texts, from Mesopotamian mythology to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that made the analysis genuinely educational. The key thing to understand is that Grok isn't making supernatural claims. It's doing what large language models do, finding patterns in language, making connections between ideas, and presenting them clearly. But when the source material is something as layered and ancient as First Enoch, those patterns become very interesting indeed. The Watchers, the part that AI flagged immediately. One of the first things Grok highlighted when analyzing the Book of Enoch was the section known as the Book of the Watchers, which covers chapters 1 through 36. This section describes a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, who made a decision to descend to Earth, take human wives, and father hybrid children known as the Nephilim. This isn't a side story. It's the entire premise of the first section of the book. And what Grok flagged is that this narrative directly connects to, and in many ways expands upon, a few cryptic verses in Genesis 6:1-4 in the Bible, where sons of God take daughters of men as wives and produce giants. The Book of Enoch names these Watchers individually, gives their leader as Semjaza, and describes in detail the knowledge they brought to humanity, including metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery, and the secrets of astrology. Grok also noted something that scholars have long discussed. The Watchers narrative has strong structural similarities to ancient Mesopotamian texts, particularly stories about the Apkallu, semi-divine beings in Sumerian and Babylonian mythology who were said to have come from the heavens and taught humanity civilization. The parallel is close enough that some researchers believe both traditions were drawing on even older shared source material. The reason this matters for the AI analysis specifically is that Grok was able to map these connections across multiple texts simultaneously in a way that a single human researcher reading one book at a time simply can't do as efficiently. It laid out the overlaps clearly and without bias, which made the case for these cultural connections more visible to everyday readers. The Nephilim connection and what AI made of it. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, are described in the Book of Enoch as giants who consumed everything humanity produced, then turned on humans themselves, and eventually turned on each other. When they died, their spirits were said to become evil spirits on the earth, which the text presents as the origin of demonic activity in the world. This is a significant theological claim, and Grok analyzed how this fits, or doesn't fit, with mainstream Christian and Jewish theology. What it found is that this narrative provides an explanatory framework that the canonical Bible leaves incomplete. The Bible mentions the Nephilim but doesn't explain what happened to them or where evil spirits came from. The Book of Enoch fills in those gaps with a very specific answer. Grok also pointed out that the Nephilim concept shows up in other ancient cultures under different names. The Greek Titans, the Sumerian demigods, and even some interpretations of the fallen heroes in ancient Egyptian texts have been compared to the Nephilim by researchers. Now, to be clear, AI is not confirming that these beings were real. What it's doing is identifying that the narrative archetype of powerful hybrid beings who corrupt the world is nearly universal across ancient cultures, which is a genuinely fascinating anthropological observation. From a storytelling and religious studies perspective, Grok's analysis made one thing clear. The Book of Enoch was not a fringe text. It was a detailed, internally consistent cosmological narrative that addressed questions about the origin of evil, the structure of the spiritual world, and the fate of humanity, all with far more specificity than the Bible's canonical books. The Fallen Angels, a roster that was almost erased. One of the most striking things Grok pulled from the Book of Enoch is that it actually names the fallen angels. Not just their leader, Semjaza, but a full roster of 200 Watchers who descended on Mount Hermon. Names like Azazel, Armaros, Barakijal, Kokabel, and Zachiel appear in the text with specific roles assigned to each one. Azazel in particular gets a lot of attention. According to the Book of Enoch, Azazel taught humanity how to make swords, shields, and breastplates, essentially, the technology of warfare. He also taught women the art of beautification with metals and jewelry, which the text frames as a form of corruption. God's judgment in the text is directed particularly at Azazel, who is bound and thrown into darkness to await final judgment. What Grok flagged here was a direct textual connection to Leviticus 16 in the Bible, where the scapegoat ritual is performed. One goat is offered to God, and one is sent into the wilderness for Azazel. Most Bible readers have never heard a satisfying explanation for who or what Azazel is in that passage. The Book of Enoch provides the context, and Grok made that connection explicit in its analysis. This is the kind of cross-referencing that makes AI analysis of ancient texts genuinely useful. Without Grok, making that connection requires reading multiple books, multiple translations, and a fair amount of academic literature. The AI compressed that research and presented it in a way that everyday people could actually follow and explore further. The astronomical sections, ancient precision that surprised everyone. Chapters 72 through 82 of the Book of Enoch are known as the Book of the Luminaries, or the Astronomical Book. This section is actually one of the oldest parts of the entire text, with fragments discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls dating back to around 200 BCE. It deals with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and it does so with remarkable detail for its era. Grok's analysis highlighted that this section describes a 364-day solar calendar, a system based on 4 seasons of 91 days each. This is different from the lunar calendar used in most Jewish religious practice, and it matches the calendar system found in other Dead Sea Scrolls texts, including the community calendar used by the Essenes. This alignment has led some scholars to suggest that the group responsible for preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls had a direct connection to the tradition that produced the Book of Enoch. The AI also noted that the astronomical descriptions in this section, while not scientifically accurate by modern standards, reflect a sophisticated observational system that would have required careful, long-term study of the night sky. The description of the sun's gates, 6 on the eastern horizon and 6 on the western, corresponds to a real observational phenomenon. The sun does rise and set at noticeably different points on the horizon throughout the year, and tracking those positions was foundational to ancient calendars. What makes this section fascinating is that it's not mythology. It's an attempt at a systematic, empirical description of how the universe works, written thousands of years ago by someone who clearly spent a lot of time watching the sky. Grok's ability to compare this against what we know of ancient astronomical systems made the analysis unusually rich. The dream visions, prophecy, or historical record. Chapters 83 through 90 contain what are called the dream visions. Enoch recounts 2 visions he received. The first is a terrifying vision of a flood destroying the earth. The second is a long allegorical history of the world, sometimes called the animal apocalypse, where all the key figures in biblical history are represented as animals: Adam and Eve as white bulls, the Israelites as sheep, their oppressors as various predators. Grok's analysis of this section was particularly interesting because it applied something historians call vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy written after the fact. The AI flagged that some portions of the animal apocalypse are so historically specific about events in Israelite history that they appear to have been written with knowledge of those events. This is a mainstream scholarly observation, not a fringe theory, and it raises real questions about when exactly different parts of the book were composed and by whom. But the vision doesn't stop at known history. It continues into a description of future events, a final battle, the destruction of evil, and the transformation of the world into a place of peace. Grok noted that this eschatological vision, the vision of the end of the age, shares unmistakable structural similarities with the Book of Revelation in the New Testament, including the sequence of a great tribulation followed by divine judgment and a renewed earth. The question this raises, which the AI presented neutrally, is one that theologians and scholars genuinely debate. Did the authors of Revelation borrow from the Enochic tradition? The textual similarities are close enough that most scholars say yes, the influence is real. Grok made that case clearly and connected specific passages from both texts to illustrate it. The Son of Man, the title Jesus used. Here is where the AI analysis got genuinely striking for a lot of people. Chapters 46 through 48 of the Book of Enoch describe a heavenly figure referred to as the Son of Man, a being who existed before creation, who sits beside God on his throne, who will judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous at the end of days. This is significant because Son of Man is the title that Jesus uses for himself more than any other in the Gospels. He uses it around 80 times across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the Gospel of Mark especially, Jesus uses it in contexts that map very closely to the Enochic Son of Man, a coming figure of cosmic authority and judgment. Grok's textual comparison flagged that the specific attributes given to the Son of Man in 1st Enoch, pre-existence, divine authority, role as judge, association with light and wisdom, match the theological claims made about Jesus in the New Testament so closely that New Testament scholars have been debating the connection for decades. Some argue that Jesus was deliberately using the Enochic title to signal to his audience what kind of figure he was claiming to be. Others argue the influence was more indirect and cultural. What the AI clarified is that this connection is not a new or fringe idea. It's been discussed in academic theology since the 19th century. But because the Book of Enoch isn't in most people's Bibles, the average churchgoer has never encountered this context. Running the text through Grok made the connection visible and accessible to a much wider audience. Why was it removed from the Bible? This is the question everyone asks, and Grok gave a nuanced, multi-layered answer when prompted directly. The short version is, the Book of Enoch wasn't removed from one Bible. It was never officially included in the Hebrew Bible or the later Protestant Old Testament in the first place. It was excluded during the process of canonization, which happened at different points for different religious traditions. The rabbinical Jewish authorities who standardized the Hebrew Bible around the late 1st and early 2nd century CE did not include it. One reason may be that its content, particularly the Watcher's narrative and its detailed angelology, was seen as potentially dangerous or heretical. At a time when Jewish identity was under enormous pressure after the destruction of the Second Temple, religious authorities may have wanted to consolidate around texts that maintained clearer boundaries. For early Christianity, the councils that shaped the biblical canon, Nicaea in 325 CE, Carthage in 397 CE, debated many texts. By those councils, the Book of Enoch had already been circulating for centuries and was clearly influential on Christian theology. But its graphic descriptions of fallen angels and its complex cosmology may have made it difficult to fit neatly into the theological framework the early church was building. Grok presented multiple scholarly perspectives on this and noted that no single, clean explanation exists. What the AI did flag as interesting is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has the oldest continuous Christian tradition in the world, kept the Book of Enoch in its canon throughout. They were never part of the Roman ecclesiastical process that defined the Western biblical canon. So whether the book was removed or never included depends entirely on which Christian tradition you're asking about. Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the book's antiquity. One piece of evidence that no serious researcher disputes is the discovery of Book of Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947. Over 20 Aramaic and Hebrew fragments of various sections of 1st Enoch were found there, and they date to between 200 BCE and 100 BCE. This makes the Book of Enoch one of the most well-represented texts at Qumran. More copies were found there than of many canonical Old Testament books. Grok highlighted this when asked about the historical credibility of the text. The AI pointed out that the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the Book of Enoch was widely known, widely copied, and treated as a significant religious text by at least one major Jewish community during the period when Jesus and his contemporaries were alive. This isn't speculation, it's archaeology. The astronomical book sections found at Qumran are particularly old, predating the final compiled form of 1st Enoch. This suggests that different sections of the text had independent lives before being assembled into the version we have today, which is actually common for ancient religious literature. Grok's analysis treated the text with the same academic framework used for other ancient documents, and the conclusion is that it's genuinely ancient, genuinely significant, and genuinely deserving of serious study. For viewers who want to explore the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, the Israel Antiquities Authority has a digital resource at www.deadseascrolls.org.il, where scroll fragments can be viewed directly. What AI said about the theology of judgment. A significant portion of the Book of Enoch deals with divine judgment, the fate of the wicked, the vindication of the righteous, and the final destruction of those who oppressed God's people. Grok's analysis of this theme produced some of the most detailed and interesting output in the whole experiment. The AI noted that the theology of judgment in 1st Enoch is more detailed and structured than what appears in the canonical Old Testament. There are descriptions of places where the spirits of the dead wait for judgment, different compartments for the righteous and the wicked, with varying conditions based on how they lived and died. This is one of the clearest early examples of a developed afterlife theology in the Jewish tradition, and it maps closely onto ideas that show up later in the New Testament. Grok also pointed out the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, which contains what's called the Apocalypse of Weeks, a schematic history of the world divided into 10 weeks of ages. This section pronounces specific woes on the wealthy and powerful who oppress the poor, in language that is remarkably direct and socially charged. Several New Testament scholars have compared this section's tone to the letter of James in the Bible and to the woes Jesus pronounced in the Sermon on the Mount. The overall picture that Grok painted of the Book of Enoch's theology is of a text that took the moral seriousness of divine justice extremely seriously, one that was deeply concerned with the suffering of the innocent and the accountability of the powerful. That message, the AI noted, is consistent across every section of the book, regardless of authorship or date. The similarities to other ancient mythologies. One of the most thought-provoking outputs from running the Book of Enoch through Grok was its comparative analysis with other ancient mythological traditions. The AI identified parallel narrative structures in texts from cultures that, according to mainstream history, had no direct contact with ancient Israel. The flood narrative that Enoch prophesies connects obviously to the Sumerian story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical flood account. But Grok went further, identifying structural similarities between the Watcher's descent and the Sumerian account of the Anunnaki, divine beings associated with the sky who interact with humanity. It also noted parallels with the Greek myth of the Titans, teaching humanity forbidden knowledge before being imprisoned by Zeus. Now, and this is important, the AI was clear that these parallels don't prove a common historical event. What they suggest, from a scholarly perspective, is either cultural diffusion. These stories spread between cultures through contact and trade, or that different cultures were independently developing narratives to explain the same underlying human experiences: the origin of evil, the limits of forbidden knowledge, the consequences of beings crossing boundaries they shouldn't cross. What Grok's analysis provided was a clear, organized map of these parallels that a general audience could actually follow. Instead of needing to cross-reference a dozen different mythology textbooks, viewers could see the connections laid out clearly. What modern scholars actually say. It's worth being clear about what the academic consensus on the Book of Enoch actually looks like in 2024 and 2025, because the text is not as ignored by scholars as popular media sometimes suggests. Grok's analysis, when asked about the academic reception of the text, drew on a substantial body of real scholarly work. Scholars like George W. E. Nicholsberg, who wrote the standard academic commentary on 1st Enoch for the Hermeneia series, have spent careers demonstrating the theological depth and historical importance of this text. Gabriele Boccaccini at the University of Michigan founded the Enoch Seminar, an international group of scholars dedicated specifically to the study of Enochic Judaism and its influence on early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. This is serious, peer-reviewed academic work, not fringe study. What Grok highlighted is that in academic biblical studies, the influence of the Enochic tradition on early Christianity is actually well established. The debate isn't whether the influence exists, it's about the degree and direction of that influence. Did early Christians borrow Enochic ideas about the Son of Man and angelology? Almost certainly yes. Did the Book of Enoch shape how Jesus' followers understood his identity and mission? Many scholars argue it did. The gap between what academic scholars know about the Book of Enoch and what average people in church pews know is enormous, and that gap is exactly what makes AI-powered analysis of this text so interesting to such a wide audience. Grok effectively democratized access to a body of scholarship that had been sitting in university libraries for decades. The questions that Grok couldn't answer. In the spirit of fairness and accuracy, it's worth spending time on the limits of what Grok's analysis could actually do, because not everything people are claiming about this AI experiment is equally well-grounded. Grok is a language model. It identifies patterns in text and makes connections based on its training data. It cannot verify historical claims, confirm supernatural events, or tell us whether the things described in the Book of Enoch actually happened. When some online commentators have suggested that Grok proved the Book of Enoch is historically accurate, or that AI confirmed the existence of the Nephilim, that's a misrepresentation of what the technology actually did. What Grok can do is analyze literary and theological patterns, make cross-textual comparisons, and present scholarly perspectives clearly. What it cannot do is resolve debates that historians, archaeologists, and theologians have been having for centuries. The question of whether the Watchers were literal beings, symbolic representations, or pure mythology is not one that any AI can settle, and Grok itself, when prompted carefully, says exactly that. There's also the question of what gets lost in translation. The Book of Enoch was written in Aramaic and Hebrew, preserved in Ge'ez, ancient Ethiopian, and translated into Greek and eventually into English. Every translation involves choices. Grok was primarily analyzing English translations, specifically versions like R.H., Charles's 1917 translation, and the more recent E. Isaac translation in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Different translations emphasize different things, and the AI's analysis reflects whatever choices those translators made. This isn't a reason to dismiss the analysis. It's a reason to use it as a starting point rather than an end point. And to Grok's credit, when asked about its limitations directly, it acknowledges them clearly. The Book of Enoch is a real, ancient, historically significant text that was kept out of most Western Bibles but preserved by the Ethiopian Church and confirmed as ancient by the Dead Sea Scrolls. When run through Grok AI, the patterns it found, connections to biblical theology, the Son of Man title, the Watcher's narrative, the fallen angel roster, the astronomy, are all things that serious scholars have been studying for decades. The AI didn't discover anything supernatural, but it made something genuinely important far more accessible to everyday people. And that might matter more than any single finding. If the Book of Enoch was widely known by Jesus and his disciples, why do you think it never made it into the Bible most of us grew up reading? Comment below.